Up until now, I had been going through the FBS conferences in a completely random order. But due to overwhelming demand, I've had to make the executive decision that allows the Big Ten to jump the queue. Actually, I don't think you say queue in America, so to cut the line, I guess. Combined, the Big Ten stadiums have a capacity of around 1 million. But that doesn't mean that the average capacity is 100,000, no. Because there are, of course, 14 teams, as you'd expect with a name like Big Ten. Anyway, here are the Big Ten college football stadiums. Beaver Stadium, home of the Penn State Nittany Lions. The stadium is named after James, a beaver who built the stadium. Most beavers build dams, but in this area of Pennsylvania, they're a little more sophisticated. That might not actually be true. The thing I love most about this stadium is that the expansions that have occurred over the years are very conspicuous. You can basically see how every section has been expanded, and you've got a bit of everything sprinkled in. I particularly like the design of each end zone. In the north, you have this big curved upper deck that hovers above the lower bowl, which is a fairly uncommon design. And the south end zone seating is similar to that of LSU's Tiger Stadium. It looks great. The stadium is set for a major renovation that will bring it into the 21st century. Because although it looks good on the outside, there are some aspects where it's lacking on the inside. Camp Randall Stadium, home of the Wisconsin Badgers. It's the oldest stadium in the Big Ten. In fact, it's named after the Union Army training camp that occupied the site during the Civil War. I'm not usually a big fan of wars, but at least they kept it civil. This one is another stadium that has a lot going on. Well, most of the capacity comes from the main seating bowl once again, which is fairly plain and simple. But then you have this sizable upper deck on the western side that curves its way around, matched with the skybox equivalent on the east. The exterior is also completely different on each side of the stadium, and it's not something I usually mention, but they have a very fancy looking field house as well. Maryland Stadium, home of the Maryland Terrapins. If, like me, you were wondering what a terrapin is, it's a turtle. They chose that name, of course, because turtles are known for their speed, strength, and agility. Nah, but turtles are cool. This one is a lot simpler than the last two. It's a fairly typical horseshoe design with the addition of very tall triple-decker seating on one of the sides. And on the other side, they've got this combination of outdoor seating and luxury suites. It looks pretty cool actually. I often note how some stadiums have an exterior that's reminiscent of a parking garage, but this one literally has a parking garage as the exterior behind the west end zone, which is very convenient. Kinnick Stadium, home of the Iowa Hawkeyes. It's named after Niall Kinnick. I believe it's the only college stadium named after a Heisman Trophy winner, which is very surprising. And yet they've got one that's named after a beaver called James. This sort of design is somewhat uncommon in college football, given that it's made up of 4 individual stands that aren't connected. But those stands do have quite a traditional look to them, with a red brick facade for the most part. But what the stadium is most well known for can't be seen from the outside. The visitors' locker room is completely pink, which is done to put the away team in a passive mood. I mean, how fired up can you get when you're surrounded by pink? It also has been known to increase their concern for having their nails broken. It even extends to the bathroom, which might not be in the spirit of sportsmanship, but it is kind of funny. I wonder what would be crossing the line. Could you constantly have K-pop music playing in the rooms? That's like the audio equivalent of the color pink. Well, to be honest, I don't even know what it sounds like, but just look at them. Memorial Stadium, home of the Illinois Fighting Illini. This one's a little different. It has a very elegant neoclassical design, particularly the exterior. It looks like something you'd see in the Ivy League. In fact, it kinda looks like a combination of Harvard Stadium and Franklin Field. Something that's quite fascinating about this stadium is that during construction, way back in the 20s, heavy rain caused one of the bulldozers to sink into the field. They decided that it wasn't feasible to remove it, so it remains there to this day. Yes, it's tragic, but at least the bulldozer driver was able to memorize the owner's manual in English, French and Spanish before he died from asphyxiation. He's a quick learner, although he did have a bit of trouble with the Japanese section. I am of course joking, nobody was buried alive with the bulldozer, but I do really like this stadium. Memorial Stadium, home of the Indiana Hoosiers. First impressions are that this stadium isn't anything out of the ordinary, and then you look behind each of the end zones. To the south, there's a miniature version of the field, and to the north, you notice a spectacular cathedral or castle-like building. Stunning. Although, as with many college stadiums, the southern end zone was recently expanded, so now it looks like this. Sadly, the little baby field was crushed. Yes, it's tragic, but it was able to memorize what concrete smells like before it died from asphyxiation. The interesting thing about this stadium is that those huge stands to the east and particularly to the west, they've been here since the stadium was built. Except there was literally nothing else, it was just grass behind each end zone. I kinda like that. Memorial Stadium, home of the Nebraska Cornhuskers. For being just humble Cornhusker folk, they've done quite well for themselves. They've built themselves a magnificent stadium with grand facades on each side. Very impressive. On the inside, it looks just as good. And the eastern stand technically has 5 tiers of seating, which you certainly don't see every day. And behind each end zone you have these huge stands, which look pretty cool. And I suppose I should mention that on game day, the stadium itself becomes the 3rd biggest city in the great state of Nebraska. Although it's not a city, it's a stadium within a city. Nebraska doesn't have many sizable cities, I think is the main point. Because as the legendary Nebraskan poet Douglas McNugget once said, "You can't grow corn in a concrete jungle." So true. Michigan Stadium, home of the Michigan Wolverines. Let me start out by mentioning that it's the 3rd biggest stadium in the world and the biggest outside of Asia, so that's fairly impressive in itself. But the stadium's sunken design means that, from the outside, you'd hardly notice that the stadium was anywhere near that size. The design, although it looks pretty good, is very simple. It's just a single-tiered bowl, with skyboxes on either side of the field. In fact, the most unusual thing about it is that it's almost perfectly symmetrical, an anomaly in college football. The stadium holds numerous attendance records, as you might expect, including the largest college football crowd that wasn't held in a NASCAR track, which was a little over 115,000. Ohio Stadium, home of the Ohio State Buckeyes. You see, I know that a sunken field design is more cost effective, and I guess it would be safer if an earthquake were to occur. But you've just gotta love an imposing exterior like that. Just look at it, it's a fortress. I'm surprised there isn't a drawbridge. That would be pretty cool. Actually, this little section was inspired by the Pantheon in Rome. But the entire stadium itself was clearly inspired by something less opulent, that being the shoe of a horse. In fact, before the southern end was filled in, it was the king of all horseshoes. Now, it technically isn't a horseshoe stadium, even if it is its nickname. But one thing that isn't in doubt is that it's a very impressive stadium. I really do like it. Ross-Ade Stadium, home of the Purdue Boilermakers. That is a very specific nickname, but I like it. You've got to be tough to make a boiler. Well, perhaps not these days. The stadium, as you can see, is that rudimentary single-tier horseshoe style that you see here and there. It's probably the simplest stadium in this conference, but for some people, that's ideal. But the stadium's south end zone is a little unusual. This section used to have bleachers, but I guess it's just this guy's private parking space now. Ryan Field, home of the Northwestern Wildcats. Now this one's got a bit more going on. It's another one with a fortress-like grand entrance, with two big white towers that can be seen from inside the stadium. It's the smallest Big Ten stadium in terms of seating capacity, and some of that seating is a little strange. The main stand's upper deck curves both from the bird's eye view and the side-on view, which is quite uncommon. And what's with this section? It seems like they should have just continued with the curve. Dunno, but I'm sure there's a reason. It's definitely a unique stadium, you've got to give it that. Scheer Stadium, home of the Rutgers Scarlet Knights. There's no obvious medieval-inspired architecture with this one, it's all fairly normal on the outside, but it does have a cannon however, so that's good. It's fired when the Scarlet Knights score, but I presume it also comes in handy when a drunken spectator runs onto the field. That actually sounds like fun. Something else that's a little unique is the red tin roof section that wraps its way around the north end zone seating, as well as this little section of the south end zone that's actually the recruiting lounge. Other than that, it's a fairly straightforward design, but a good one. Spartan Stadium, home of the Michigan State Spartans. This stadium has a very clean design. It would even be perfectly symmetrical, just like the other stadium in Michigan, if it wasn't for this built-up side over on the west that was added in 2005. I like it. It's modern, yet traditional. And it's the only side of the stadium with a particularly good-looking exterior. The rest is a bit meh. It may come as a bit of a shock, but due to this section, the stadium is actually the tallest building in the city, provided you exclude those smokestacks over there. And to be fair, the city has a smaller population than the stadium's capacity, so it's not much of a brag. And finally, TCF Bank Stadium, home of the Minnesota Gophers. It's the newest stadium in the conference, although you might not be able to tell just by looking at it. They have tried to stick with a traditional college football aesthetic. Kind of. I mean, there weren't really any designs quite like this in the 1920s, but the exterior is still fairly classical looking with the extensive use of brick and whatnot. You also get a decent view of the Minneapolis skyline from some vantage points, which is always good. The stadium is designed to be able to seamlessly expand in the future if need be, and you can just tell by looking at it where the additional seating might be added. It's a great stadium to end with. And that's all for today's video. If you enjoyed it, please consider subscribing. Thanks for watching, have a good one.